you think the current administration, I know they just came into power, but do you think they have taken significant steps so far to reform SOEs?
Now there are three main credit rating agencies: Fitch, Moody's, and S&P. So as you have noticed, Fitch and Moody's upgraded our credit rating to out of default credit rating, but S&P did not upgrade. They did not upgrade Sri Lanka out of bankruptcy in their rating, and the reason they provided was on the debt restructuring process. There's a bond from Sri Lankan Airlines which is for about 175 million US dollars that hasn't been restructured yet. So because of that, they haven't upgraded us from their credit rating default setting.
Current government has abandoned plans to privatize Sri Lankan Airlines. What is the cost or risk involved or the cost that has to be borne for not privatizing it?
Just in the last budget, the government absorbed 500 million US dollars of debt from Sri Lankan Airlines to the treasury. That simply means all citizens taken that burden, which is about 150 billion. That is equivalent to the entire pay tax collection of the country, and that's just 1 year and not all losses.
We have to pay a lot of debt in 2028. So do we have the necessary framework to pay back all this debt in 2028, and not just to pay back debt but to remain stable while we do that?
At the moment, I think yes. If we continue in that direction, I think we can manage. But the challenge would be afterwards, because if we do not, as I mentioned, grow the economy, we will fail.
Welcome everyone, you are watching Conversations with Alanki. This is the first conversation for the year. Now there were many conversations and discussions which revolved around the economy of Sri Lanka, as many Sri Lankans began to focus on the importance of having a stable economy. So as we begin the first conversation of the year, it would be on the economy, and joining me today in this episode is Dhananath Fernando, CEO of Advocata Institute. Welcome, Dhananath.
Thank you, Alanki.
Thank you for being here having this conversation. Second time on my show, and obviously things are different now. We have a new government in place, a new administration, and I believe that when governments change, the way they look at things and conduct affairs is also different. So firstly, let's talk about the IMF requirements. I think one of the key requirements of the IMF was to increase tax revenue. Today, I just came across this article which said that some experts say that top earners are evading tax. How do you see this, and are there any effective measures to address this?
So on taxes, Alanki, our tax revenue has increased overall under this for the last year. It has increased by about 25% from the previous year.
Okay.
But it is true there is tax evasion takes place, and also there are many tax holidays that has been given by the government. I mean, many governments who have been passed. So there has to be measures, and that measure needs to mainly come from the Inland Revenue Department or the tax collection authorities. So we have the Inland Revenue Department, we have the Excise Department, and we have the Sri Lanka Customs. So those are the three main institutes that we have to strengthen. Out of that, I do not recommend on taxes collected mainly at the customs, because tax at a custom means that you are burdening the consumer.
Indeed.
But on the Inland Revenue Department front, I think there has been many changes that has taken place, but I think a long way to go, mainly on digitization aspects and getting everything into one system. If you recall, under the previous government, they mentioned if you are 18 years above, you have to open a tax file, and you need to give your TIN number when you are opening a bank account, current account, when you are registering a vehicle, when you are taking a construction permit. Unfortunately, that hasn't been enforced, which I think could have been enforced. But on minimizing evasion, there are two fronts. One is just because you increase the tax rates. When you increase the tax rate above a certain threshold, of course, people evade taxes because they don't see an incentive. It's like just because you increase the tax rates doesn't mean that your tax revenue is also going to go up proportionately to the rates that you increase. At the same time,
But it also creates an unfair system.
absolutely, it creates an unfair system. So I believe at the moment our tax rates are quite high. I mean, 36% for the highest personal income bracket is quite high, and VAT is 18%. Corporate tax is also 30%. And on the taxes, we have to look at these tax rates also on a competitive basis, because people are now, it's a global village, people are considering the tax rates with your neighboring markets. So for an example, in the UK, it's about, corporate tax is about 25%, and here it's 30%. Someone can argue, okay, why am I paying 30% where I have better options for investments in 25%? But of course, we had a difficult time. We have to increase the tax revenue as a percentage of GDP. So my recommendation would be increase the tax net through this system called the RAMIS system. It's implemented, and expand that further and increase the base. I think that's the only way out to minimize the evasion. And through the RAMIS system, when you connect the data, for an example, if someone doesn't declare the tax adequately, but if you have the system, for an example, what type of vehicle that they use, what's the price that they have purchased, through the bank's system, like how many accounts that they have, then you can cross check and at least easily have a query asking, why aren't you paying your taxes? So then those people can get into the tax net. So those are the broader measures that I would like to recommend rather than increasing the taxes.
So that brings me to my next question now. Just over 2 years ago, we were faced with bankruptcy, and recently we had some good news where Fitch has upgraded Sri Lanka to CC plus from restricted default. So what, in your view, which measures taken help Sri Lanka to recover from this situation?
Multiple measures. First is the monetary system stability. What I meant by the monetary system stability is the inflation. Because when the cost of goods are increasing rapidly, no one can really plan anything, do any businesses. So that monetary system stability is one of the key factors. Second is, for that rating upgrade, is also this government's decision of continuation of the IMF program. Because without the IMF program, we will not be able to move to any direction, because your debt restructuring cannot be completed, and you will not be able to get the support from your international partners, nor for any local partners to moving forward. So the continuation of the IMF program I see as a second main reason. The third one is also completion of the debt restructuring process. We have done the local debt restructuring a few months ago, and now after December, the international sovereign debt restructuring has also been completed. So those three are key factors, and also the political stability to an extent, because investors worry, because rating is, they are giving an outlook of how the country's economy is going to be. So when you have political stability, especially with a 2/3 majority and the same executive president representing the same party, that provides some level of stability. Because if you do not have political stability, then there can be elections, then the new government can come into power, and then there will be policy changes. So at least there will be some political consistency can be predicted. So I think those are the four main reasons for the rating upgrade. But at the same time, we have done on the previous measures as well. Our tax to GDP ratio has been doing well, and we have achieved the primary balance, and we have managed our expenditure. We have somewhat better social safety net program, taking care of poor with Assasuma initiative. So likewise, those were in the right direction. So that's, I think, overall helped. I mean, those actions were the root causes, or like root results that delivered the final result.
One of the main things you've always spoken about, reforming state-owned enterprises. And I remember we had this discussion in our previous conversation as well. So do you think the current administration, I know they just came into power, but do you think they have taken significant steps so far to reform SOEs? Or do they seem to have a plan to reform SOEs?
So far, I did not see any significant measures on reforming. Of course, they are new. I think we have to give them a little bit of time. But I just want to reiterate the importance of it, of reforming the state-owned enterprises. Since you brought about the credit agencies upgrade on our credit rating, now there are three main credit rating agencies: Fitch, Moody's,
Yes.
S&P. So as you have noticed, Fitch and Moody's upgraded our credit rating to out of default credit rating, CCC plus and CAA1.
Sure.
But S&P did not upgrade. They said they are upgrading on the long term bonds, but they did not upgrade Sri Lanka out of bankruptcy in their rating. And the reason they provided was on the debt restructuring process. There's a bond from Sri Lankan Airlines which is for about 175 million US dollars. That hasn't been restructured yet. So because of that, they haven't upgraded us from their credit rating default setting. So that indicates the importance of it. Without restructuring, this negative credit rating on certain credit rating agencies, they will consider that is quite cautious.
So would you say that the situation is still volatile?
Absolutely. I mean, we are still at a sea level, at least I mean, we have the access for credit markets, but for us to have reasonable interest rates, at least we have to move up to B category. So that's why I said state-owned enterprises reforms are important. I think what the government could do is, of course, I think in their election manifesto and some of the sentiments they mentioned was they are not for privatization. So if privatization, I think, of course, we cannot privatize all state-owned enterprises. There are multiple options we can evaluate: what has to be merged, what has to be go for public-private partnership, so on and so forth. But at the initial stage, if privatization is too distant, what they could do is go with the IMF governance diagnostic report, which basically recommends to have a holding company of state-owned enterprises. Now the challenge is, Alanki, minister appoints the director board for those state-owned enterprises, which puts minister in trouble, so as the board of directors. Because imagine you are the minister, you are appointing me, and I can do whatever that I want, but you will have to take the responsibility politically. And at the same time, there can be all corrupt deals because the minister appoints the director, and so it's not transparent. There's no meritocracy. I mean, the minister can appoint whoever to the board of directors.
So there is a lack of independence.
Absolutely,
right?
lack of independence and integrity. So what IMF recommended was, you set up a holding company, and all the state-owned enterprises, we have a lot. Government releases data about like 52 to 55 state-owned enterprises, but in our analysis, there are about more than approximately about 500 state-owned enterprises. Of course, those are in different categories. Some are statutory boards, so on and so forth. But what they recommended was, okay, you have a holding company, and that holding company is responsible for all state-owned enterprises. And this holding company is owned by the government. So there's no dispute. Government owns that holding company, but holding company directors appoints, taking the responsibility, and appoints the directors on a meritocracy basis. And then they can have the KPIs and review the performance and see whether those entities are making profits, losses, any issues. They can do it. And that's one of the key priority. The IMF governance diagnostic report had 16 priority recommendations. And this is one of those priority recommendations. So I think if it's too distant, that's what they can do, because at the moment, I think some of the state-owned enterprises, we haven't appointed the board members, and without the board members, we know those companies are not moving in any direction, because you cannot have any board meetings, no direction, and officers are not working because they don't know what would happen. So
is that normal? I mean, can you expect it to be done already?
No, I think the government will hopefully appoint sooner, but already, as you know, from the presidential election, 3 months had gone, and from the parliament election, again, more than a month had now gone. So that means taking time means you're making those organizations vulnerable for more and more losses.
Sure.
And anyway, they have been loss making. So if you are keeping it on a competitive environment without a direction, you are making them vulnerable for losses. Also, some of the entities are monopolies, and like that's the only institute that runs on that business sector. So then you are making higher vulnerability for corruption. Because when there's no director board, anyone can, there's room for make some decisions at a lower level which can be prone for corruption.
So, would it be right to say that if state-owned enterprises are not reformed, it could be a burden on the public?
It is right. I would go one more step. If we do not restructure state-owned enterprises, we will reverse back to a crisis. Because
Okay.
now let's imagine 175 million bond is a big amount, and losses on those entities are colossal. You cannot bridge it by tax revenue.
Now, we just spoke about Sri Lankan Airlines, and the current government has abandoned plans to privatize Sri Lankan Airlines. So, what should the public know about this? What is the cost or risk involved, or the cost that has to be borne for not privatizing it?
I think since the best example, the best stat that I could provide is since 2008. Now this is 2025. Almost for the last 15, 17 years, Sri Lankan Airlines has not made a single cent of profits. Even the losses were severe. Just in the last budget, the government absorbed $500 million of debt from Sri Lankan Airlines to the treasury. That simply means all citizens taken that burden. And to what extent? 500 million, if you keep it on 300 rupee exchange rate, which is about 150 billion, that is equivalent to the entire pay tax collection of the country. And that's just 1 year, and not all losses.
That is a significant amount.
That's a significant amount.
Right. So, like you said, Dhananath, now the advocata, the advocata has mentioned that the government is borrowing heavily through treasury bills or bonds. What do we need to know about this?
The government is constantly borrowing money, which I do not see that has to be the normal procedure of the government, but we need to know why the government is borrowing so much money. We are borrowing money to settle the previous debt. It is like
So you're borrowing to pay back what you owe.
Absolutely. So you are basically rolling over. It is like you are borrowing from Peter to pay Paul.
Right.
So we borrowed a lot of money earlier, and now that is coming due. And when it's due, we don't have money to pay in our coffers. So what we do is we go back to the market and borrow money and paid for what we borrowed yesterday. So then actually there's negative, there's no real transaction, because you have already spent that money what you borrowed, and when it's due, you are borrowing again and settling that. So constantly you have to borrow.
So it's a never-ending cycle.
It's a never-ending cycle. You are not only borrowing for the money that you borrowed before, you are also borrowing to pay the interest. Even if you, next 5 years, if you look at, they have to borrow more and more. So that's the importance of what you call a primary balance. Because primary balance is your income minus your expenditure without that interest payment.
Sure.
So if you have a positive primary balance, means after you pending on everything except the interest, you have some saving. So from that saving, actually you can pay some of the interest at least. So then you need not to borrow for the entire amount. The principal and the interest together, you need not to borrow. At least you can pay something that you have saved through the primary balance. So that's why it's important. But any government has to pay constantly, and I think people should be aware of the game that we are going to play after this debt restructuring. Again, we are not going to pay, service our debt from the money that we have saved in our kitty. We are basically going to go to credit markets again after we upgrade our credit to probably about a B plus. And again, we are going to borrow money from the markets. And the only thing why we need to borrow money from the markets, not for any development projects, not for anything, just to settle the previous debt and the interest. So this is in a way a dangerous game, because you are borrowing not for any development project, but We do not have any other option.
I have a question. So if all governments obtain loans and but some are also of the view that Sri Lanka fell into a debt trap because of this. So where do you draw the line? If every government is obtaining loans, how did we fall into this trap?
Yes. So the trap is exactly, you borrow money to settle your previous debt. So you are basically rolling over. The trap was we borrowed too much money in dollar terms at very high interest rates and in short maturity. Now that when you get into that trap, it's very difficult to come out. I think Albert Einstein once said, compound interest rate is one of the best inventions in the world. The people who understands earns it, and the people who do not understand always going to pay for it. So I think we are on the wrong end. So the debt trap is when we borrow too much money at high interest rates. And now the only way that we can come out is by growing the economy. Because when you grow the economy, you can increase your revenue on one side, and your debt burden as a percentage, your GDP is coming down. It's like, imagine you are carrying a heavy weight on your shoulders. The only way that you can carry more and more weight is by strengthening your legs or your muscles. So then you can bear a heavy weight. To do that, you have to grow the economy. So when you have high debt burden, rather than you're reducing your debt, you're growing your economy, so the burden becomes lesser. At the same time, through the primary balance, you continue to service, and slowly over a longer period of time, you bring down the total debt. But this takes years. You cannot bring down debt for zero overnight. It takes a lot of time. But that's why the primary balance is important, that you have to save some money at least, because it's not only about the debt, it's also about the interest. Because there was one point, even our revenue wasn't adequate to pay the interest. Forget about the principals. So for that, I beg your pardon. At one point, we did not have our revenue adequate to entire our debt servicing. That is principals plus interest. So at least we should be able to cover our interest rate. I mean, the interest, we have to have some saving, otherwise we are going to go for this trap. So that's where the trap comes, and the only way out. But a lot of people looking only at the servicing part, but we have to look at growing the economy.
So like you say, the sustainable way of actually sustainable solution to come out of this debt trap is to grow the economy. So if you could tell me in a nutshell, how can that be achieved?
So first, let me explain what growth means. Growth means, Alanki, you and I will be earning, let's say if we grow, if we double the size of the economy, you and I should double our economy, the income as well. So we will see a completely different world, different Sri Lanka if we grow the economy. And to do that, we have to grow at about 5, 6, 7% economic growth rate we have to achieve. And when you grow the economy, means we are producing more, and we are producing more means we are earning more. It's like if you are doing this show once a week, you have to do twice, for an example. So that means you are growing, so your revenue grows, then the facilities grows, the support teams gets better pay, likewise. So to grow the economy, the number one thing that we could do at the moment is improving the productivity. Because if you increase the investment also, you can grow. But no one is want to invest when the country is at a default state. So then what you need to do is, with the existing resources, how are you going to improve the output? To do that, the only thing that you could do is increasing the productivity. That's number one. That means you are doing more with less resources. But overall, what you need to do is, there's a land problem. We have to solve that land problem if we were to attract investment. And also there's a labor issue problem, because our labor laws are quite archaic. So those changes we need to do.
So we did speak about how to come out of this debt trap and solutions as to how to grow the economy as well. So now that brings me to my next question. We have to pay a lot of debt in 2028. So do we have the necessary framework to pay back all this debt in 2028, and not just to pay back debt, but to remain stable while we do that?
At the moment, I think yes. If we continue in that direction, I think we can manage. But the challenge would be afterwards, because if we do not, as I mentioned, grow the economy, we will fail. The only anecdote that I could provide, Alanki, is this is in a cricket game, you have to defend your wicket. At the same time, just because you defend your wicket doesn't mean that you're going to win the game.
You have to score as well.
We have to score. But again, if you lose the wicket, that means you also cannot score. So you have to defend the wicket and score. And at the same time, just defending the wicket doesn't mean that you're going to win. So in the same way, you have to remain stability. To do that, you have to be in the same structure. But at the same time, you cannot be obsessed with stability. While you are stable, you have to score runs. That's what I said. We have to do the land reforms, because then you can increase the output. We have to do labor reforms so more people can join the labor force. Our female labor force participation is extremely low. So I think there has to be labor regulatory changes. There female can join the labor force. Investors are finding it difficult to invest because 82% of the land is owned by the government. So they should have more access for land. Capital, there are problems with someone is going to set up a business, register a business, so many barriers. That has to be under Clean Sri Lanka probably cleaned out. So then they can come and join the workforce. So when you do that, then you are scoring runs. If you don't do it, if you are only thinking about the macro stability and debt to GDP ratio and income, government revenue to GDP, then you're only defending the wicket.
Sure.
You're okay, but after 2028, you're going to face a big problem. And at one point, when you're defending the wicket, is basically, it means you're losing if you're only defending the wicket. So you have to score runs. And the way out scoring runs is do hard reforms like state-owned enterprises reforms and also the trade reforms, because what we do is when we produce means we also exchange and export, we trade. So we have to do trade reforms and trade more and more on the things that we produce. And to trade, we have to produce things on a competitive basis. It has to be price-wise, quality-wise, should be competitive with the global standards. So for that, we have to work hard. So that's the formula, and it's not an easy one, but it's not an impossible one as well.
Right.
I think we can
I suppose as long as you have a good framework and you have good policies and where implementation of these policies actually take place. So before I move on to the final question, Dhananath, there has been a lot of talk about the infamous bond scam, and it has been getting a lot of attention over the years. But then there are also many other scams. Let's take, for example, the sugar scam. Some of these scams are as big or maybe even bigger than the bond scam. So why don't these other scams receive the same attention?
So most likely it will be for political reasons.
Right.
But I can bring the economic aspect of it. Every time, Alanki, when there's no competitive process, you're opening up opportunity for a scam. Now let's take the sugar scam.
Right.
It has been addressed even in the IMF governance diagnostic report. So basically the minister has the discretionary power to impose a special commodity levy at any point.
Right.
So that means if I am a sugar supplier, if I know the minister is going to increase the taxes tonight or after weeks time, I have an advantage of that information.
Sure.
Because I can order sugar early in greater stocks and ask the minister to jack up the prices or the special commodity levy, and then all sugar prices will go up, and then from that stock I can keep a margin. You call it a rent. So when you have those options of minister or one official having the discretionary power to change the tariff overnight, you're opening for corruption, and that can easily be a scam, and that's what is happening. Even if you look at the bond scam, it is the insider information that has been discussing about.
Sure.
So it's no competitive environment. There has been someone had that advantage of knowing that information, that the bond auction, the bonds that the central bank is going to purchase is much higher than actually what they have offered. So that insider information, the asymmetry of the information is basically a scam. And the more that you do that, you are more opening vulnerability for scams.
Absolutely. So moving on to my final question, Dhananath, now the IMF has stressed on the importance of eliminating corruption and also corruption within institutes. And this is one of their key requirements. Have the necessary steps been taken so far?
Not fully at the moment. There has been some attempts
Okay.
because on money laundering, and there are certain attempts, but there has to be many other regulatory framework that needs to be strengthened on anti-competitive trade practices and cutting down this discretionary power. And also we need to do it not because the IMF says it,
but because it's the right thing to do.
It's the right thing to do. And I think it's a shame that the IMF has to come and pinpoint and say do this and put it in a report, because it's obvious there's when you keep that open, I mean keep that room to change the tax rates, keep those options open, it's automatically getting a scam. So it's not the IMF, it's us. We have to take the responsibility and then do the right thing, because it is the right thing to do, and that's the only way that we can take Sri Lanka to the next stage and, in President's terms, clean Sri Lanka.
It's just been a few months since the new government has come into power, but everyone says let's give them some reasonable time. But if you take something like corruption, what is a reasonable amount of time?
Theoretical side and a practical side, Alanki.
Yes.
I think corruption laws and getting those stolen money back takes a lot of time.
Right.
I mean, it can go to decades. But for a government, and also you have to do it in the proper mechanism.
Sure.
Just because you think someone was corrupt, you can't just take them into jail and put them behind the bars.
But I mean, even institutional corruption.
Correct.
Can that be addressed soon?
Yeah, I think ideally about 18 to 24 months is a reasonable time, at least to show some indication on how things move on the judiciary's front, and how the investigation, at least if the investigations can be accelerated from the law enforcement front, I think that's a reasonable period. But the challenge would be after 6 months, when the anti-corruption drive is slow, that also becomes a resistance to the government, because 86 months gone, you haven't seen anything.
You need to keep the momentum going.
We have to keep the momentum up, and we have to accelerate the investigations. And then I think there are a lot of reforms needs to be done also in the judiciary system in terms of digitization. There were some attempts made by the former Minister of Justice. So those things helps to clear the cases, because now the average time for a criminal case is about 10 years.
Right.
Cannot expect these...
and justice delayed is justice denied.
Absolutely.
Right. All right. Thank you very much for this conversation, Dhananath. It's always a pleasure having a conversation with you, because I feel that you talk in layman terms which anyone can comprehend. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed this insightful conversation. Stay tuned for my next episode. Until then, stay safe and take care.